Hello and welcome to today's video. Now this video has been a frequent request, and that is the airbrushing 101 sort of video. Now there are loads of videos on airbrushing on YouTube, on blogs, etc. So this video is just how I airbrush, the sort of tools that I use to airbrush, what I would recommend, and it's going to go into basically, as I said, what do I use. It's going to talk about the different techniques that I use for airbrushing, but primarily I'm going to be focusing on the cleaning, because the cleaning is the biggest obstacle that you're going to have with airbrushing, and it will save you a whole lot of time if you can airbrush and then clean properly and understand the frequency of the cleaning that is required, because I don't think people do it enough. I'm a small scale airbrush, if that's the correct term. So I like really small lines, as you can see on this 50mm half track. So it's really important that we understand how to airbrush and how to clean, and I'm going to show you that in this video today. So to start off with, we want to get an airbrush. I use an Iwata Neo CN airbrush, or should I say this was my first airbrush I got. You can see it's relatively cheap. For airbrush, $70, I believe this is US, is really cheap. And this is a really good entry-level airbrush. Then when you want to get to accompany that airbrush, you want to get an air compressor. So the air compressors that you can get really do come down to how big you want your tank. I've got an entry-level hobby compressor. The tank is very small, so it's constantly vibrating and refilling that tank up with air. But this is pretty much what everyone uses in terms of entry-level wargaming airbrushing compressor. Then this is the sort of thing that you want to go for. Again, relatively cheap. You know, we're talking about $130 US so far that we've spent. Then you want to get the applicable hose that goes on. Now, some of the hoses you can get, or for the airbrush, you can get a quick disconnect. So if you've got multiple airbrushes, you can just throw them on and off without having to purge the air from your compressor and switch them around. I don't have one of those just because I don't really care about purging it. It's only a few minutes, but it's up to you. Then you also want to get yourself an airbrush holder / like waste removal. So for some of those nasty liquids that we're putting into cleaner or excess paint. So you can pick one of these up for about $10. I mean, this one's 14. You can definitely get them cheaper than that. And they've got a little filter inside, so you'll spray the nasty paint away, and then it'll make sure you don't get any of the nasty fumes come towards you. Now, this pipette is something that I would highly recommend getting. But I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail later. So just remember, I've recommended pipettes, but it's something you might not want to do. Then you want to get yourself a cleaning kit. Now, don't go crazy with this. I literally just grabbed something cheap. So you can see a $6 one here. I don't really use the cleaning kit, to be honest, but it's a good to have just in case you need it. Then we need to talk about the protection, the PPE. So we want to make sure we're wearing a face mask. Now, I know if you're using water-based paints or acrylic paints, you're probably not really going to be using this sort of stuff. I don't. It's do as I say, not as I do, but it's really up to you if you want to follow this. So then, how are we going to use all of this new stuff that we've acquired? So let's have a look. Now, in this shot, you can see that I've got a different airbrush. That's my second airbrush. Actually, I have 3, but we're only showing you 2 today. That's the Harder and Steinbeck Evo, which I'm going to go into in a little bit more detail later on. But you can see that I've got those pipettes there. I've got a nice little 1/2 mil sort of spoon, as well as a little metal stirrer. Oh, those pipettes have gone walkabouts. And then I'm also going to grab my Iwata Neo CN. Now, this is the airbrush that we're going to use to start off with. Don't worry, we are going to go back into the Harder and Steinbeck, but I will explain why I switch them around, so you can have a full understanding and appreciation of the 2 different types of airbrushes that we're using here. Now, the compressor is really straightforward. You can see that it's on now. This is the model compressor that I'm using. I'm not going to go into details. I can try and leave a link for it, but it's a very old compressor. They're all pretty much exact same thing. To get the air on this, you can see it's on 1 path, 15 psi. You literally lift up this little black control lever here, turn it clockwise, to increase the amount of air that's being allowed to come through your airbrush, and then rotate it anti-clockwise to bring it back down. It's as simple as that. This little lever here is to purge the air. So if you turn it off, obviously don't leave it on because it's just going to keep trying to top it up with air. You can purge the air from that tank just by doing that. Or you can just sit there and just disconnect your airbrush and let the air come flying out. Now, one of the things I would absolutely recommend if you are new to airbrushing, start with Tamiya paints. Now, don't brush paint these on. Sorry, that's a bit of a tongue twister. These are just absolutely great airbrushing paints. I would not recommend brush painting them on for wargaming figures anyway. These are great, but you must make sure you give them a really good shake and a stir. That's what I'm doing right now. Another really good tip when you're airbrushing is to ensure that you thin down those paints. Now, this Iwata Neo CN has a 0.35mm needle and nozzle. That is quite big for airbrushing. So you're not going to be, you can do if you've got really good control, but realistically, you're not going to be doing super fine lines with this type of airbrush. You can do it. Honestly, you can do it, but you're not going to if you're just starting out. So if you've seen that, I've mixed in that paint in my paint palette, and I'm adding in a little bit of thinners, or that Tamiya thinners, into my airbrush, and I'm just making sure that it's cleaned out. Now, what I did there is actually block the nozzle because I'm going to give this a bit of a better clean out. And the reason I'm doing that is because you'll see in a second. So you can see that I'm just going to block this nozzle, put pressure down, and you can see that that is making like a bubble, a ripple effect inside of there. And that's going to capture some of those loose bits of paint, if there are any in there, but I always clean mine anyway. So you can see that that looks pretty clean. Now, you can see that I've got my paint in this palette. I'm using my pipette to suck up that paint, and then I'm going to add it to the airbrush. Some people will just add the paint and thinners in that airbrush and together and mix it in that way by blocking the nozzle and giving it a little bit of air and letting it mix that way. I just do not agree with that whatsoever. I think you're going to be in for a world of hurt. It's not going to mix properly. Then you can apply it. So once we've done that, we can put it in the we've put it in the gun and we can give it a good coat. So you can see that the paint's coming out really nicely. I thinned it down because of the size of the needle. The bigger the needle and nozzle, the smaller amount of thinners that you need to put in there, because it's just a bigger hole for the paint to come through. So the paint build up around that hole isn't going to be as severe as it would be if it's a smaller needle. Now, to clean the paint out of that pipette, it's literally just hot water and soap in that little pot that we saw just in the previous slide. So yeah, it's really, really straightforward for this part. This is my sort of just rough and ready airbrush. Now, once we've got that paint on our model, you can see that I'm using that Tamiya thinners again. So it's really, really important that whatever you go with, if you go with Vallejo or whatever, you use the applicable company's thinners. And I'm blocking that nozzle again. Now, can you see all of that thinners is coming right back up and it's bubbling up? That's just mixing that thinner in with that paint. And you can actually see that paint starting to run down and come off the side of it. So that's going to help with the internal parts of this airbrush that's going to have paint that's going to be going back towards the trigger. So I'm going to empty the contents inside of that pot. And then what I like to do is I'm always using kitchen towel. So get the kitchen towel and I clean the bulk of that paint out of it without disassembling it or anything like that. I'm just making sure I get the bulk of it out there. That way we can then apply some more of that thinner and really give it a good clean up. Cleaning your airbrush is the most important part of airbrushing. I cannot emphasize that point enough. My third airbrush I bought from a guy that said it just didn't work anymore. And I was like, okay, that's strange. There's not much to them. It was purely because the needle had stuck with paint. Give it a good clean out using this sort of method. And I've had myself a really cheap airbrush that's a really good airbrush too. So you can see that I did the exact same method again, put some thinners in there, gave it a spray. And I could see that the consistency was more milky opposed to like full on paint. So now I've taken the actual paint lid or holder off so I can get that kitchen towel in there a little bit more accurately, and I'm giving it a really, really good clean. I'm just spraying the actual kitchen tile to see, is there any paint coming out of there? It'll be thinned down, obviously, but I just wanted to see. Now, because this is just my beat up run around, I'm not really too fussed about it. I'm not going to disassemble it from bit to bit and give it a really good clean. Because the nozzle is already really big, at 0.35, I consider that really big. The paint buildup around that's probably not going to be there. So I'm really not too concerned. And you can see that I'm spraying and I'm looking to see now, is there any of that German yellow coming out of the airbrush, which there doesn't appear to be. And I couldn't see it. I normally look as well. I couldn't see it actually inside of there. So I'm happy with that, but I'm not happy with this little nozzle part. So I'm just giving that a little go there. Obviously, you're not going to be able to get the paint inside the nozzle, but because we've sprayed it out, it's been spraying out clear, then we know that that nozzle's unblocked and it's looking pretty good. This other part, a lot of people won't even have on. They leave this little cover off, but I just put it on anyway. It's obviously there for a reason. So yeah. So we can go ahead and have a look at the harder on Steinbeck 2-in-1 Evo and have a look at how we clean that a little bit better and how we operate a finer airbrush. Now, some of the important things to remember, as I've said in that previous bit of the video, is make sure you mix the paint in a painting palette. Operate around 1 bar of 15 psi when you're airbrushing, especially for those fine details. Smooth trigger movements. We haven't talked about that yet, but we will do it in a moment. Allocate time to airbrush. Do not rush it. You don't want to leave paint in that nozzle. And then clean after every session. Do that. Do not skip that step. Make sure you're always cleaning after each paint. So I'm using the Harder and Steinbeck. This is my go-to for intricate airbrush work. So this is the Evo. Now, unfortunately, I believe this particular model that I've got is old now. It's 5 years old, this airbrush, and it's going really strong. It's a lovely, lovely airbrush. You can get the Harder and Steinbeck CR Plus. There's lots and lots of other airbrush out there. Just because they're really expensive doesn't mean that they're good. So do your research. But Harder and Steinbeck are really, really well known for having fantastic airbrushes. You can also, with certain airbrushes, you can get different size needles and nozzles. So don't just get the needle because it won't fit in the nozzle. You want to make sure you get the nozzle too, even though I've put the needle on here. You want to get the set. So the 0.15mm needle and nozzle is the smallest needle and nozzle you're going to get, and that's what I'm going to use for my 15mm vehicles. So we've got the Harder and Steinbeck Evo. I can't decide which way around it should be, but I've got my Harder and Steinbeck Evo. Now the 0.15mm needle nozzle is absolutely tiny, so any tiny bit of thick paint is going to block that hole. So yeah, make sure you clean it properly before use. Now you can see with these needles, it's really, really, really easy to damage that tip. So do not put them in tip first. Always make sure you're putting it in through the back like I am here. Unless you're used to doing it, But it's a really good technique just to stop you from bending that needle. Because of how thin this needle is, any slight bend in that needle is going to give you some sort of splatter and not have really smooth control. So now I've put that back together, we're using those Tamiya paints again. Now, because of the size of the needle, again, being 0.15mm, so it's a very, very small needle and nozzle, I'm putting in my paint and I'm going at a 1-to-1 ratio of paint to thinners now. So it's a really, really runny consistency. And I'm ensuring that there is no chunks of paint that's going to block up that nozzle. Sorry, I'm trying to mix the two words together. So once I've done that, I get that little pipette again and I'm applying the paint in there. Try and be as clean as you can do here because it's just going to be unnecessary paint. And now let's have a look at how fine you can make these lines. So that control now is what you want. You can see that I'm slowly pushing my finger down and pulling it back until that air starts coming out. And then I've got some really nice control. And it's a really good practice to do. Make sure you're testing it beforehand. Now, unfortunately, with this vehicle, I decided to actually go with a bit of a thicker camo scheme to it because this is actually going to come out as a painting tutorial sooner rather than later. But you get the gist. This is an airbrush with the correct needle and nozzle that can really put out some fantastic fine work. And it has done with my Flames of War miniatures. And you will see that in the future, no doubt. And if you want to go back to some of my old videos when I very first started YouTube, then you're going to see them on there. Now, to clean this airbrush, the principle is exactly the same as what I did with the water. I'm giving it an initial go with my kitchen towel first. So you can see I haven't even used the cleaning kit yet, guys, either. So I'm using that kitchen towel and I'm putting in the same thinners from the company of the paints that I'm using, so Tamiya. I'm going to block that nozzle and I'm going to do the same thing again. You can see all that green paint is coming back up. So I can see that by spraying it out, it looks almost identical to what it went in. So I've got rid of all of that excess thinners and now I'm doing the process again. So this is the second round that I'm doing. So you can see that now we're getting bubbles, but it's not as green. There is a very green, it almost looks like a glaze now. So that's okay, but I'm still not happy with that. That's still not good enough for a 15mm nozzle. You want to make sure you're cleaning that perfectly. So whilst there's still thinners inside of there and it's still moist inside of there, is the perfect time to really scrunch down that bit of kitchen towel, make it super fine and put it in as if it's the needle. And you can see that you can see the little hole. Hopefully you'll be able to see it in a minute. I'm going to try and get it so it comes into light. Just bear with me. You can see it there. That's how tiny we're talking. A very, very minute hole that we need to make sure isn't blocked. So we're going to go ahead and give it another go with this. See if there's green paint on the tip, which there isn't on the kitchen towel. And then I'm looking in that hole again just to make sure there's no bits of kitchen towel that have now blocked that nozzle. So I'm giving the rest of it a go and I'm pretty satisfied. I'm going to take the needle out and I haven't disconnected. I'm not going to take the needle out just yet. I will do in a little bit. I'm going to give it another go with thinners just to see what we're dealing with, how bad or how good have we cleaned this. So let's have a look. You can see that the thinners aren't changing color, which is fantastic. You should be able to see the needle. If you can see the needle, then I'm pretty satisfied that it's relatively clean. Now there will be paint towards the trigger, which is what you really want to avoid. And that's all comes down to trigger movement. So when you are holding down the trigger, make sure you pull it forward again to stop the air coming out. Don't just let go of it because it will stay. The paint will stay in there towards the trigger. So you can see I'm giving it a really good clean again. So this cleaning kit that I told you guys to buy at the start hasn't been used. Now I'm taking out the needle and I'm just going to wipe it clean. And you can see that there's just a little bit of green there. So that's closer towards the trigger. The little like, so you see the trigger on the screen there. If I'm putting the needle in backwards now just to see if any paint comes running out from inside, because you can actually visually see it. And I'm just putting in there just to see, did we get much paint come through? Yes, we got a little bit of paint come through. So that's not good. We don't want all of that paint in that part of the airbrush. It's not much, guys. It's very, very thinned down as well. So it's not going to cause too much damage. But if it's left, it could bite into that needle and then your trigger's going to be stuck and you're going to really have a pain trying to get that needle out. So it's really important that we clean it out as best we can. Now, if you need to clean the airbrush properly, so this is clean, I would be more than happy with this and use it another time. But if I wanted to give it a really, really deep clean, I would use this Mr. Tool Cleaner. Well, I do use it. This stuff eats through paint. So be very careful. If you're using an old one, you've got old O-rings, it's probably going to eat through those. But I put a little tiny touch of that in, leave it for 10, 15 minutes, come back. In this case, I already know my airbrush is clean, so I'm just showing you. Come back in 15 minutes time, follow the same principle and just see, are you getting any of that nasty sort of color paint coming out? Or is it nice and clean? It's just like clear. There's nothing coming out. The kitchen towel is clear. Then you're happy. Now, I know it looks a little bit green there, but it's actually, I think it's just the light that's coming through. That is clear. So yeah, that's basically it. There's really not much more to say. I've got videos on how I airbrush. Like I said, go back to the very first videos I did if you want to see some really intricate airbrushing. And I've got loads of videos already out there on how I airbrush and the different sort of techniques to airbrushing German camo and stuff, because that's probably the biggest pain when we're talking about painting vehicles. Now, I will answer questions, so leave questions in the comment section, guys. I will do a Q&A in the future and answer those questions for you. So let's get a part 2 Q&A video going if you want it. So whatever those questions I haven't answered, please do let me know below. Huge thank you goes out to my Patreons and YouTube channel members for making videos like this possible. I'm going to leave it here, guys. I really hope you've enjoyed it and learned a little something. Sorry for my mumbling, but it's just the way I operate. So yeah, thanks a lot, guys, and I will catch you at the next one.